Rite of Passage, the podcast with Giabra Martin.
Good morning, Mel,
Morning.
and welcome everyone watching. This is episode 3 of the Rite of Passage podcast, and we are here today with Miss Mel Parrish. So, how are you this morning?
I am good. My husband took my three boys, so the house is quiet. And so I've been working on my audiobook this morning, so it's been really nice.
Probably a rare occasion.
Yeah.
Oh, that's actually the first thing I wanted to talk to you about. So, I have an 11-month-old son,
Mhm.
and my writing has slowed way down. Like somehow I thought I was busy before I had a kid. It is another level, and I'm
No.
still adjusting, but you have managed to write so far 2 books while, raising 3 boys, young boys. Um, if you can pull that off, then no one anywhere has any excuse why they're not writing their book.
I don't know about that, but it is definitely a challenge. That is for sure.
How do
And
you,
life is so different with kids. That is also for sure.
it's one like my sense of time is totally different, right? I mean, like the last 11 months could have been a week long, could have been 10 years. I can't imagine life before. I know I had 32 years of life before, but that feels like a totally different world, but Um, it's the most rewarding thing ever and also the most challenging thing ever. So, but yeah, when do you manage to write?
So I get up between 4 and 4:30 in the morning before my kids wake up.
Yeah.
So that's when I have never been a morning person ever,
Mhm.
but if you have a passion for something, I found that you're willing to do what it takes to make it happen. So that's I get up in the morning and I do all the book stuff. So whether that's content creation or emails or writing, and I kind of plan out through the week what days I'm going to be focusing on what. And then when my kids wake up, then we put that on pause and go through the day with my boys. So it's very challenging to find the balance between
Right.
each. And I was trying to allot time during the day to do writing with my kids at home, and it just was not, it just felt very conflicting with the other. And so it was just, okay, I've got to be able to separate this out from my day with my kids to make it work. And that could change in the future as they get older. But my oldest is 6. And so they're all still home. And because I homeschool as well.
Right.
So I'm a little bit crazy. But so I have them all the time. And so that's it just works best for me to separate out time from
You know,
my mom time.
so you have like a good structured kind of plan, and
Mhm.
there's this thing in Eastern philosophy which is like expectations are the heart of all your sadness and anger. And I do find that I'm like, I sit like the kid's napping, I sit down to write, and I'm like, all right, we're gonna do it. And then he wakes up. I'm like, it's like I thought I had a plan, and then life has its own plans for you constantly. Uh,
Yeah.
but I like that. I found too that early in the morning is the most productive. Like trying to do it at night just doesn't happen. Too many things come up, or you're just burned out from a full day. But that 4 in the
Yeah.
morning window, 5 in the morning window, before any emails, calls, before the dog even wakes up, amazing time to get some stuff done. So
Yeah, and with kids especially, I feel like you are so burnt out at the end of the day that it's not a great creative mindset to go into, especially with
Mhm.
writing, because it's such a mental process. And so if you're not mentally there, it's too hard. And I don't feel like at least for me, I never am doing my best work at that point.
Yeah, you
It's
can't
almost
like
just kind of a chore.
half write a book. Like you need to like live it, feel it. I mean, it just needs to like consume you. So to be like half in and half out and tired,
Mhm.
it just yeah, you're not gonna make anything. It maybe could be good for editing, proofreading, like those kind of more just like
Yeah.
kind of busy work and less of the creative side, but the creative side demands your full attention for sure. So you are the author of the Lives Entwined series. Looks like
Mhm.
the first one is Tucked Away, and then the sequel, Emerge. Is that the one that the audiobook you're working on currently?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
so that is in production.
Yes, the audiobook is almost, we're hoping to have it done by before Christmas. So it's the second book is quite a bit bigger.
Mm,
than the first book, and so it has definitely been, and there's a lot more characters and things that are introduced in the second book.
yeah.
So that has been something with my narrator that has been a challenge for him.
There's a bit of back and forth, and it is they have to make a lot of creative judgments, right? About like how do you approach these different characters and what kind of voice do they have? And like you want it to sound natural, but you need to distinguish them, and then it can't sound forced. And it's definitely a collaboration
Hmm.
to get it right, and just it's got to flow well. So I certainly understand that. So it's a young adult fantasy series.
Hmm. Yes.
What inspired you like for this genre, and kind of going the young adult route? I know a lot of people kind of go like the spicy route, or like it seems like you're like, you know what, I'm a mom, I got young kids, like I'm not, it's going to be something I can stand behind, I can be proud of, I can show to my friends and family. So tell me
Yes.
about that a little bit.
So funny enough, so I actually originally with this with book one, I started going the traditional route
Mhm.
of querying agents, and I had two separate agents who were interested in moving forward, but they both wanted me to add explicit content into the books because
Yeah,
they said that's more marketable, and
this
which
is
is
what's selling.
true. I'm
There's
like,
certainly a big audience.
if you look, it is true.
Yeah,
But I just grew up off of Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and all of these series that I just feel like they're for everyone. And that's
right.
what I love about like clean fantasy is that the whole family can enjoy it. You know, you can sit down and watch it, or like if you the movies you can watch with your 10-year-old, or you can read these stories, with your 10-year-old or your 90-year-old grandparent. And
Yeah.
that's what really appeals to me as a reader and as a writer is
Mhm.
I want people to be able to experience it in their families, not just as an individual. I mean, obviously that's fun too, but I just think there's another element of something when a whole family can read something and discuss it and love it together.
Yeah, and enjoy like the movie someday, and it's appropriate for
Hopefully.
everyone in the room. That's the dream, right? Every writer
That's
has
the
the
dream,
dream.
right?
No, you
But
are
yeah,
correct
that's
though.
a huge thing. That's a huge thing for me is having it be available for a group of a family to read.
Yeah, and there's certainly something there. Like, obviously, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter can stand on their own merits without any of those other pieces. But it
Hmm.
also occurs to me, and not to pick on, let's say, 50 Shades of Grey, I'm not sure who reads it twice, right? It's like maybe if you're, I don't know, like really lonely or something. No offense, but it's like you read it once, okay, I know what happens. I got the, but something like, I mean, Harry Potter has just endless metaphors and layers, right? And it's, like you'll find different things at different points in your life reading it. And that's kind of the beauty is like, it's fiction, but there's something about it that's so true and universal that like people just want to explore it and continually explore it. Read the book, watch the movie, read the book again, watch the movie again. It just has never-ending layers. So is your book kind of like that? I mean, is there kind of some deeper kind of levels to it?
Yes. So, my favorite review that I've received of my book so far was that it is like Lord of the Rings meets Anne of Green Gables, which
Okay.
is like the craziest. Like when they said it, I was like, oh, but it really is. It has aspects of those two stories coming together, and so there is a lot. I'm really into philosophical readings and things
Yeah.
like that. And so that's what I love actually about fantasy is that at least most of the fantasy that I read, it fantasy itself has a lot of foundations out of fairy tales
Mhm.
and mythology in some senses. And so a huge part of those is the morals, right? Or the lessons or the underlying themes that are being taught. And I guess that's my struggle with some of the modern day, especially the romanticy genre, is that I feel like romanticy should be placed more under romance as a
Mm.
subgenre than fantasy,
Yeah. Yeah.
because a huge element of fantasy, in my experience, is the underlying themes and the morals and the things being taught, as well as the real world building, which I feel like in a lot of romantasy and things like that, there's not necessarily a huge focus on that
The
aspect of
emphasis isn't like it's almost like the fantasy part is just a stage where these
it.
spicy scenes can take place, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that drives me crazy as a fantasy author and writer is because I just so much yeah, I could get on a whole soapbox about this because I just feel like I'm like this is not fantasy, this is romance, which is fine. Like I
Right.
think it's obviously a lot of people enjoy that and that's great, but I just don't I feel like it shouldn't be labeled under fantasy because it's so much of it is focused on the romance and
Yeah.
not on the world and the building and all of these things that you see in true fantasy.
Well, to put maybe a silver lining on it, maybe that romantasy thing can kind of be a bridge from people who normally wouldn't be reading fantasy to
Mhm.
like start coming into the genre and be like, there's something I like about this.
Yeah,
So maybe
that's true.
everything has its place, right? But
Definitely.
here's a just really quick tangent. I've been talking about this with my wife, just some of the metaphors in Harry Potter. One of them is Quidditch. And
Mhm.
it's like, as an author, you're like playing this totally different game from everyone you know. You're like, hey, I'm creating something out of thin air, just ideas in my head. I'm putting them on paper. I'm making them tangible and real. I'm trying to build a career out of it. And then, everyone in your life is probably playing Quidditch to a degree, right? It's like just a really standard game where the rules are established and they might not understand what you're doing, but like you're chasing this thing that is just like a completely different game within the game. And that's kind of like a really interesting metaphor for like the different paths people take through life is like you can win the traditional game, but it's also possible to, win this entirely different game that's kind of invisible to everybody kind of thing.
Mhm.
But I think that's why people keep re-exploring something like Harry Potter is because like on every level, I mean, if you're a kid, it's magical, it's wonderful. But as an adult, like you might even see something that like, there's something to that. So like at every stage of your life, there's something in it for you kind of thing. And I think fantasy more than any other genre has the ability to kind of provide that to readers, right? Like,
Mhm.
yeah, it can be a totally different book for you at 8 years old or, 80 years old, and there's still something in it for you. So I have mad respect for it. I've always been intimidated by it though. Like when I read Lord of the Rings and all the names they come up with, like characters and fictional places, I mean, they are entire worlds.
Mhm.
You kind of have something like that. I mean, it's just like these people are traveling to these, I don't know. Like, did you build like an entire world in Tucked Away and Emerged?
Yeah, so in my the type of world building that I do, it's very interwoven into the character development. So
Mm,
it's something that is unfolding through the story. So as you get deeper into, so Tucked Away is very much like setting a foundation for a lot of, very much like an introduction into your main protagonists and kind of laying the foundation for the world. And then in Emerge, you start getting more into understanding how things work, how things are operating, the
mm.
different groups or kinds of people and how they impact one another. And yeah, so it definitely is there's different groups or kinds of people of this world, four of which are immortal and one of which is mortal.
Mm.
And then and they all kind of and then they all impact each other and they're in conflict with
Okay.
each other in different ways. And so, yeah, so it definitely is it's a lot to keep track of, that's for sure. And it gets very overwhelming as the writer because
Yeah.
especially when you're leaving because you have so many storylines and then you start and you're like, "Oh, I got to remember to like come back and pick up that cliffhanger and do something with
Right.
that." And so it can be very overwhelming at times, but I also love that challenge of
Right.
bringing all of these storylines and connecting them and kind of weaving a tapestry almost with
Well, this
these
is kind
stories.
of, I think this is kind of funny, but your office is amazingly tidy. I'm picturing like if I tried to write something like that, it would look like when some paranoid person in a movie is trying to solve a murder and there's like strings going, me trying to keep track of the details. I'm like, this connects to this. And my office would look insane if I tried to, like, I don't think I could keep it all in my head kind of thing. Yeah. How big do you imagine this series being? Like how many books in total? And we won't hold you to that number, but just kind of your general thoughts at this moment.
So it's planned to be a 5 book series.
Okay.
So I'm writing book 3 right now. And yes, it's will be at least what I've plotted out is to do a 5 book series, and I have the titles and everything for all 5 and kind of the gist of, so the titles kind of align with what's happening in that specific book.
Okay.
So the titles connect, and that's kind of the journey of the series is you start in Tucked Away and then Emerge, and then it kind of goes from there, and then it will resolve in the last
So
book.
tucked away, your first character, he's a recluse, but
Mhm.
then like something shifts and he's forced to come out in the world, and then book two emerge and maybe they begin upon their journey, something like that. So you kind of, and I feel like you'd have to be like that, right? I mean, to do a series like this, you'd have to kind of know how it ends, and then you're like filling in everything that needs to happen between here and there, and um, yeah, that is quite an undertaking. How long? I imagine maybe you had this idea and then sat on it for a long time because you're like, I don't even know how to like get started with that. How long did it take you to get tucked away out there?
So I actually started writing, I wrote Tucked Away and most of Emerge 10 years ago.
No kidding.
And I had a chronic illness at the time.
Mm,
And so I was dealing with chronic pain and things like that. And so it was kind of a way for me to process what I was going through at that. I've always like had to write. That's how my brain
mm,
processes things.
okay.
And so I busted those out. It took me about 2 years to write both of them. And then
Mhm.
I got married and started having kids, and it was kind of like, okay. And then I had the whole thing with the agents, and so I was like, okay, I'm going to, put these on the back burner for now. And then we're done having kids now, and I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to move forward, and it just kind of like things just opened up to
Right.
start going down this. So I went back through everything and kind of got back into the world and into writing, and it's been a very long arc of a process, but
Right.
it's been really cool to have that gap because
Mm,
obviously when I originally wrote it, I wasn't married, I didn't have kids. My life experience at that point was very different. So it
right.
was very interesting to go back into and have a very different perspective of life and go
Yes.
back into these characters and kind of fine tune them and reshape them a little bit from the perspective that I have now.
That is actually very interesting. And you got so many ideas rolling for me. One of them really quick is, I mean, I have a book about a guy who like he gets dumped and comes home to a letter, and then he like sells his car and his house, or sells his house, quits his job, and just takes to the open road. And now I'm like a father and I'm married. I'm like, that guy's ridiculous. Like, get it together, dude. I was like, and I enjoyed the story, but I was like, I don't know, I don't relate to that guy. Um, one of these things, especially with the writing, like I want everything on my schedule, right?
Mhm,
But there's like a time and place, and it is funny, like when the timing is right, it feels like channels open up, and the universe conspires to like let you write your book. But then there's other times when you are just like swimming against the river and like nothing
mhm,
wants you to put words on paper. But I've kind of learning slowly, even though I fight it every day, that like no one's ever early or late to anything. Timing, it just things work out when they work out the way they're supposed to. Um, but I mean, you've got the two books, they're here, they exist. When those first copies come in, right, and you get them and you open the box, and you're like, oh my God, this is my idea made tangible.
mhm.
That's an incredible feeling. So, and
Absolutely.
yeah, but I can relate to a lot of what you're saying. The third book, are you currently writing it? Are you editing it?
No, I'm writing it. So, the third book is kind of where a lot of things start falling apart.
Okay.
And so it's kind of this journey where, we've started off. The main character in my book's name is Master Abrax, or Abrax. He kind of evolves to just Abrax, but he starts off where he's basically built this sanctuary deep in the woods away from everyone.
Okay.
So no one goes to his home and things, and then he he has brought something that alters the course of his life. So in Emerge is him kind of being stepping out and taking on the world and stuff, and then in book 3 things really begin to fall apart because,
It's
and I
hard.
feel like that's kind of, I don't know, maybe not for everybody, but I feel like in life, a lot of times we all have those moments where it's like we've taken a step back from everything, and then you start getting out and you're like, okay, like this is
Not so
good.
bad.
This
Yeah.
is fine. And then things really like hit the fan, and you have to decide, are you gonna go back to being like, that was too hard, or are you gonna
Right.
keep moving forward? And so that's kind of the decision and the things that are begin to happen in book three.
That is definitely a powerful metaphor for life. I kind of honestly, even on this writing journey, I like wish I was 18 again. Like I know so much more. At 33, I'm like, I have the information. At 18, I had the stupidity to be like, yeah, we can do anything, and like sometimes if you knew how tough a journey would be, you might not embark upon it.
Hmm.
Um, so it is interesting, but yeah, there's got to be that moment, that dip in the middle where you're like, it gets really dark before the dawn, and I'm not sure if we'll make it through this thing. So.
Well, and I think as especially going the independent route as an
Right.
author, where I mean the buck doesn't just stop with you, it is you. Like you
Mhm.
have to do everything. And so I think there is a lot of people who start this journey of being like, yeah, I'm gonna make my book happen and I'm gonna do it on my own terms. But then the reality of marketing and doing all, and coming up with all this investment and all of these
Right.
things to make it happen, that is really intimidating. And
It's
there
a
are days
job.
where you, yeah, like you look at it and you're just like, okay, do I keep moving forward, or do I just be like, okay, maybe not, maybe this isn't actually for me?
You're like, I should
And
probably go make some money or something.
yeah.
No, it has to be for the passion, right? Like that's
Mhm.
the only way it can work. But like when you're first starting your first book, you have this vision that like I'm gonna write it and then like everyone is gonna read it. It's gonna be great. Just because it exists, it's gonna work kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um and it's probably good we go into it with all those like possibilities, but otherwise, like, maybe you wouldn't. But anyway, it's got to be the passion has to be like the thing, right? I mean, that's what
Yeah.
it starts and ends with the passion. But for sure, as an indie author, you wear a lot of hats. And I was thinking, I mean, all the different skills you learn from like the cover design and editing to like website design to different marketing, all these different social media platforms. I'm like, I've picked up a lot of skills that are probably like pretty marketable. I'm like
Yeah.
a lot of things as an indie author. You're like, I can do a lot of stuff. Yeah.
And you start to understand how the industry works. And
Right.
I think that that's something as a writer, you can be a phenomenal writer,
Mhm.
but not a good author, because an author incorporates so many other things than just writing. And I think that's something that I did not realize when I decided to embark on
Yeah.
becoming an author, is that you have to be good at pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. And it's one of the greatest ironies that some of the people that are the most introverted people are the ones that really have to get on here and promote themselves and be really pushed out of their comfort zone. I Most of the authors that are my friends that I've met and stuff on here
Mhm.
are not these like really extroverted, wanting to be in front
Outgoing.
of, yeah, like
Yeah.
wanting to be in front of the camera doing the thing all the time. And so it's just a really ironic thing as an author to kind of be willing to do that for your work.
It's got to be so good for us, right? I have a feeling that anything we're scared of is probably good for us, assuming
Mhm.
it isn't physically dangerous. Like skydiving, I don't know, is so good for us, but getting out of your comfort zone, just
I've been
expanding.
skydiving. It's so good for you.
It is, but it's honestly, it took me a while because I'm like, because you got friends and family who follow you on social media, and you're like, oh, good. Like everyone I know knows exactly what I'm up to all the time. Like, this is great. Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know if you ever really get comfortable with it, but you get comfortable with the discomfort. And I think that does maybe serve you as a writer too, that, because I mean, every hero's journey is like, it's not a good story unless the hero is faced with a challenge that is like going to push them to their very limits. And it isn't always clear if they're going to make it out of that situation.
Yeah.
And, you know, being an artist is a similar situation in a lot of ways. Obviously, not from a physical, but, like, hey, I'm putting a lot into this dream and the odds are against me, but I believe, keeping faith in myself, going to work hard. Um, yeah, that was kind of a riff there, but yeah, I mean, you give me a lot of good thoughts, honestly. There's a lot that goes into this. So you were telling me you've always been, let's say, like a writer. Like you talking journaling. I mean, someone who just like I need to get my thoughts on paper.
Yeah, so when I started keeping a journal at 8 years old,
Hmm.
and my first entry in my journal says, "When I grow up, I think I want to be a writer."
No kidding.
And just like every page is how much I love writing and I love writing. And I have like my first little poems
Yeah,
in
yeah.
that little thing. And so for a long time, I would say probably, yeah, I always was writing in little journals and I have all of them. I got a big old stack of, and whether they were journaling my life or, writing little stories or little poems and
Yeah.
things, that's just been, I've noticed for me that if when I'm not writing is when I start to like mentally I don't process things well. And
Yeah.
so for some reason it's a way for me to release things and let them go. And so if I can write it out, whether that's in a story or even, writing what's happening, it helps me release it and move on from it.
There is something to that. It's like I don't have to carry it anymore because I set it over here and now I can take it off my back. There's something, it's one of those things like eating spinach or stretching where I'm like, I know it's so good for me, but some seasons it's easier than others to just like get in a steady, like, hey, 5 minutes a day, I'm just going to get my thoughts on paper so I don't have to walk around with them so much.
Yeah.
For anyone listening, highly encourage journaling. And actually, some of my best story ideas came from like journals I picked up of my own from like you like read something that you wrote, like you woke up from a dream and just wrote it down and didn't even remember doing it. And you're like, wow, there's something here, you know. You find
Mhm.
interesting things in your journals that can be very valuable to you.
I think it also helps with creating perspective
Mm,
for different characters because, when I read my journal from an 8-year-old me, I mean, it
mm.
seems like it's written by a completely different person
Right,
because
right.
it's written from this little 8-year-old perspective, and it helps you remember how different at different ages people have such different approaches and different perspectives and the way that they process and see the world. And so for especially for writers who are writing characters of different ages than they currently are,
Yeah,
helps you go back and be like, oh yeah, when you're 8 years old, your emotion pendulum is very big. Kids they
right.
go from one side to the other very quickly, and they're able to release things. They're able to go from being extremely angry to totally fine
Yeah, that
really
you can't
quick.
like ruin their day. Like an adult, like you can have your day ruined at like 7 a.m. and you're gonna deal with that. But a kid, I mean, they bounce back quick, right?
Yeah, and so
Mm,
that's been something is it as a fantasy author, I have characters of lots of that was another thing that I wanted. I wanted to have because that creates the world, right? Having these characters of different
right.
ages and having characters that people of different ages can relate to. Um,
That's actually a brilliant idea, though, right? Because like if I wanted to write from the perspective of an 8-year-old, I like I'm not really sure how I'd approach that. But if I could read something that was like myself at 8 years old and be
mhm,
like, okay, here's the way I thought, here's the way I spoke, here's where my vocabulary was, my kind of emotional state, mental state, my understanding. Um,
mhm.
I mean, that's brilliant, but obviously requires like from a young age, your journey.
Yeah,
You're like,
not everyone probably
someday,
has,
like
but
this
yeah,
at 8 years old, someday I'm gonna look back at this and I'm gonna be very glad I wrote this down.
yeah.
Yeah.
In book two, I'll give a little. I have a character named Avery, and in
Mhm.
this, she loses her grandpa. And
Mm,
I lost my grandpa around the age of 10.
mm,
And so I was in her story is a little bit of my self going through that process at the
yeah.
age of 9, 10 years old. And so I think that, I mean, for anyone who has kept journals, there is such a power in being able to go back and relate, even though it's not exactly the same situation or anything, it's
Right.
definitely fantasized or whatever. There's threads of truth in characters that aren't necessarily always going to be what people pick up.
Right. And yeah, writing is, I mean, it's such an extraordinary art form. Like, and I'm not sure if people totally understand this all the time, but people can only really talk about what they understand. So, like, when someone's like, oh, I'm not like a jealous person or this person's this way, I mean, everything you say is some kind of mirror of like
Um,
yourself. So when you read a book like yours, Tucked Away or Emerge, and there's these entire worlds and all these different characters, what's so kind of trippy is like all of these characters are you. They're like
Mhm.
some different facet of Mel's personality that she's able to like bring forth. And I don't think an author, any author can really develop a character they do not understand in any compelling way. So it's like these people all have to come from you. Like none of them are you, but all of them are. Um, and for that reason, I have always had tremendous respect for the fantasy writers because I mean, it is building an entire world. It's a crazy idea. I mean, honestly, like
Mhm.
this thing that came out of your head, it's like a little acorn, no one can see it. You're telling people I got an idea, and they're like, yeah, okay. And then you emerge with this book, emerge, and it has yeah, but it has an entire world and all these people, and they have all these lives, and they're all interconnected. It's we have an extraordinary art form. I mean, it is endless possibilities. I mean, it is legitimately magic.
Well, and I think that's also why being a avid reader
Mm,
is also the best thing you can do if you want to be a writer. And
right.
because the more you read, at least for me, like I'm a sponge when it comes to the things that I read. And and so the more you read, especially you want to read the caliber of writing that you want to achieve.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you're wanting, so I love just reading just a phenomenal writing, even if sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm not
Like, am
quite
I
picking
on
up
that
what they're
level?
putting down. But it's like when you read that, it really starts to get things forming within you. And so I think that's another thing as a writer is the more investment you put into reading and having characters and being like, oh, I really align with that character or things, it helps you in forming characters. Because at least for me, um, my characters formed a lot more from experiences than
Hmm,
people per se. I
interesting.
have a lot of people who talk about like, writing their bad guys after they're like bully or something from school, which I think it can be like the starting point of a character.
Yeah,
But
like
I
if you
think
give the person a face just to, from the get-go or something like this.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I feel like there's so many more nuances and things that
Yeah.
it takes to add those layers to characters to make them believable as people.
Right.
Because people are not, straightforward.
There's no like simple answers to explain a person. Like,
Mhm.
even your childhood bully probably had a crazy broken home, and that broken home had a whole story, and that person was probably also a victim. And real lives are not simple stories
Yeah.
by any means. So that is interesting. Like you're talking about it comes from experience more than actual people. But it would have to be that way, right? You did say one thing that I definitely thought was very interesting is like reading at the caliber you want to be at. Like I know this is true in sports. I haven't really thought of it like that with writing, but at least consciously. But I know like in boxing, right? Like if you want to get better, you get in the ring with someone who is going to pummel you, and you have no choice but to like quickly kind of get to their level. And I mean,
Mhm.
you're not doing them much service, right? Like they're not getting a lot better, but you trying to, get to their level, rise way up. And I will tell you, the first time I read The Hobbit, I was absolutely just blown away. I was
Mhm.
like, I didn't know books could be like this. I'm like, I mean, it's a masterpiece of just invention and creation and imagination run wild and like an amazing kind of way. Are those the sort of books that kind of inspired you with like Tucked Away and Emerge? Like, what are your personal favorites?
So, that's hard. I would say definitely Lord of the Rings, Hobbit. Definitely, I mean, that is a core still. I mean, I read that at least once a year. I go through the whole
Yeah.
thing once a year. I would have to say Harry Potter because that was literally I was, growing up the same age as the kids in the book, so
Right.
it was a huge part of my childhood. I would also have to say Victor Hugo, which
Mm,
is not necessarily a fantasy,
nope.
but him as a writer is like Les Miserables is just one of the most beautiful
Yeah.
stories ever written. It's just I mean, the layers and things in that story are just phenomenal, and the characterization of, oh, there's so many, I could talk about Les Miserables all day long, but there's a lot of, and I would also have to say C.S. Lewis. I read a
Mm.
lot of things by not just Chronicles of Narnia, but a lot of his other works, and I really appreciate just great writing.
Yeah.
Whether it's fantasy or not. I love Blaise Pascal, who's a philosopher from like the 17th century. And but I love seeing like life through these different people's throughout times perspectives, and just how human I actually, when I was in college, I was going to go into anthropology
Oh,
because
interesting.
I just am so fascinated by little worlds. Like if you go into people's cultures, they kind of have their own little world. And we
Mhm.
do that even as individuals. We kind of have our own little world inside of us, but then we
Right,
have
right,
families that have their kind of little world, and then it grows out from there. And so
right.
I've always just been fascinated by humanity in general, and just seeing the way that people's minds work and the way that we connect with one another, and how you can have two people that cross over briefly, but that can have such impact on each other without necessarily realizing it. And there's so many things there, but yeah.
Hmm.
That was a long tangent.
I need to get off the free version of Zoom because we have 2 minutes left, and it actually makes me incredibly sad because I'm getting a whole lot out of this conversation. You've got an amazing mind, and I mean, you've got my wheels turning. But I want to ask you this, and I'm just kind of compelled to ask you this because it's interesting. At 8 years old, you identified I want to be a writer, and I'm so curious. Like, if you could have a conversation with that 8 year old, like, how would she look at you as the author that you have become, like her dream come true, and then what you would kind of tell her, kind of thing. So, anything you think about that, and then we'll get your plugs into before we get kicked off because I want anyone who listens to this to be able to find you right away, take a look at your book. So.
I think the biggest thing I would say is to just be true to yourself,
Hmm.
and to keep moving forward. So whatever blocks or whatever things get in your way, it's temporary. And as long as you keep putting one foot in front of the other, you'll be okay, and
Like
you'll
you
get
can
there.
go on pause, but you don't give up.
Yeah,
Put things on pause, but you never quit.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna for sure bring you back on this show because this is cool. And you've got me inspired. I'm like, I want to go read something amazing and I want to get in. Let's get your plugs in. So obviously you're on Amazon,
Mhm.
under Mel Parrish, author, Tucked Away and Emerge, and then any social media you want to plug in the names.
So it's just author _ Mel Parrish. I'm on TikTok and Instagram. My audiobooks are on Audible, and the books are also on Kindle Unlimited as well.
All
And then
right.
book one will be on the first editions of the